Welcome back to our channel. Today, we drift into the shadows of history to uncover the harsh realities of Rome and how they punished captured queens. From acts of brutal humiliation to public spectacles of domination, we explore the stories that Rome tried to erase, but that have echoed through time. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into history, and comment below where you're watching from and what time it is as you join us on this journey. Rome liked to describe itself as the light of civilization in a dark and chaotic world. Its writers spoke endlessly of law, discipline, roads, order, and reason. Marble statues showed calm faces and controlled power. Coins carried the image of emperors as benevolent fathers of the world. But behind this carefully constructed image was a far more brutal reality, especially when Rome faced something it did not fully understand or could not easily control. One of those things was a woman who ruled. To understand how Rome punished captured queens, you first have to understand how deeply Rome feared them. Roman society was rigidly hierarchical and intensely patriarchal. Power flowed downward from male authority. The father ruled the household, the senator ruled the state, the general ruled the army, and the emperor ruled all. Even Roman women of high status were expected to operate behind the scenes, influencing quietly rather than commanding openly. Public power, visible authority, and military leadership were considered fundamentally masculine. When Rome encountered societies where women ruled openly, commanding armies, negotiating alliances, and embodying the identity of their people, it challenged Rome's entire worldview. A queen was not merely a political rival, she was a contradiction. In many of the cultures Rome conquered, queens were not symbolic figures, they were living embodiments of their people's sovereignty. They ruled by lineage, tradition, religion, and personal authority. Their legitimacy did not come from the Roman Senate or from imperial decree. It came from their people's belief, and belief, Rome knew, was far more dangerous than weapons. Rome could defeat armies, Rome could burn cities, Rome could crucify rebels by the thousands, but belief was harder to destroy. This is why captured queens terrified Rome in a way captured kings rarely did. A defeated king could be humiliated, replaced, or absorbed into the Roman system. He could be turned into a client ruler, paraded as proof of Roman superiority, or quietly removed. Kings were interchangeable pieces in Rome's political game. Queens were not. A queen carried emotional and symbolic weight that could survive defeat. Even in chains, she could inspire loyalty. Even in silence, she could become a legend. Roman historians themselves betray this fear in their language. When they wrote about male enemies, they focused on strategy, courage, or treachery. When they wrote about powerful women, their tone changed. Queens were described as unnatural, hysterical, overly emotional, manipulative, or dangerous by nature. Their leadership was framed not as skill, but as moral corruption. This was not accidental. It was propaganda designed to justify what Rome intended to do to them, because once captured, queens were not treated as ordinary prisoners of war. Rome's punishments were never random. They were deliberate, symbolic, and theatrical. Punishment was not about justice, it was about control. It was about sending a message that would echo far beyond the battlefield. And when it came to queens, the message had to be absolute. Rome understood the power of spectacle better than any ancient civilization. Gladiatorial games, public executions, triumphal parades, all were designed to teach the population who held power and what happened to those who challenged it. Captured queens were folded into this system of fear with chilling precision. Before a queen ever reached Rome, her transformation began. Royal clothing was stripped away. Jewelry that symbolized divine favor or ancestral authority was removed. Hair, often a sign of nobility and cultural identity, was sometimes cut or left unkempt. The goal was not simply to restrain her body, but to dismantle her identity. Rome wanted the queen to arrive not as a ruler, but as a broken symbol of defeat. Chains were carefully chosen. They were not hidden. They were meant to be seen. In Roman culture, chains represented total domination. A chained body was a body that no longer belonged to itself. For a queen, once seated on a throne, once obeyed by thousands, chains were the ultimate humiliation. Rome understood this psychological destruction was more powerful than physical pain alone, but fear drove Rome further. A queen was not punished simply because she rebelled. She was punished because she represented the possibility of rebellion continuing. Rome believed that if her dignity survived, so might resistance. Therefore, dignity had to be destroyed publicly. This fear was rooted in Rome's own history. Rome itself had once overthrown kings. Roman identity was built on rebellion against monarchy. The early Romans expelled their kings and swore never to be ruled by one again. Yet over time, Rome became an empire ruled by emperors in all but name. This contradiction haunted Roman political culture. They feared monarchy because they recognized its power, and a queen embodied monarchy in its most emotionally resonant form. Even worse, queens often stood at the intersection of politics and religion. In many societies Rome conquered, queens held religious significance. They were priestesses, divine representatives, or descendants of gods. To their people, harming the queen was not merely a political act, it was a sacrilege. Rome knew this, and it used it to its advantage. By humiliating queens, Rome symbolically humiliated the gods and traditions of the conquered people. It was domination on a spiritual level, but this strategy carried risk. Mistreating a queen too brutally could backfire. It could turn her into a martyr. It could immortalize her as a symbol of resistance. Rome walked a careful line: destroy her authority, but control her story. Punish her body, but shape the narrative. This is why some queens were paraded, while others were quietly erased. Rome adjusted its response based on the perceived danger of memory. In Roman eyes, the most dangerous queen was not the one with the largest army, but the one whose story could survive defeat. That is why Roman writers worked so hard to control how these women were remembered. Queens were depicted as mad, reckless, or immoral. Their victories were minimized, their defeats exaggerated, their motives questioned. By attacking their character, Rome attempted to undermine their legacy. But even this reveals fear. If queens were truly insignificant, Rome would not have needed to rewrite their stories. Captured queens represented everything Rome claimed to oppose and everything it secretly understood. They were living proof that power could exist outside Roman authority. They reminded Rome that loyalty could be deeper than law and that identity could outlast conquest. So Rome responded the only way it knew how. With domination that was meant to be unforgettable, yet for all its cruelty, Rome never fully succeeded, because the very act of punishing queens so harshly ensured they would not be forgotten. Every chain, every humiliation, every distorted account preserved the memory of a woman powerful enough to frighten the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known. Rome feared captured queens not because they were weak, but because they were strong in a way Rome could never fully control. Rome never believed punishment was simply about correcting wrongdoing. Punishment to the Roman mind was a language. It spoke to the conquered, to the citizens, to future enemies who had not yet dared to rise. Every act of punishment carried meaning, and the more powerful the enemy, the more carefully that meaning had to be constructed. When it came to captured queens, Rome was not improvising cruelty. It was delivering a message with surgical intent. Justice, as Rome understood it, was flexible. It bent to politics, optics, and fear. Roman law could be precise when it served the state, but mercy could vanish instantly when an example needed to be made. Queens were rarely judged by the same standards as other prisoners of war. Their fate was decided not by what they had done alone, but by what they represented. Rome asked one question above all others: what lesson must the world learn from this woman? The answer shaped everything that followed. From the moment a queen was captured, she was no longer treated as an individual. She became a symbol, a living sentence imposed upon her people. Rome believed that victory was incomplete unless it was visible. A dead enemy could be forgotten. A humiliated one could be remembered forever. This belief sat at the core of Roman punishment, and it explains why spectacle mattered more than fairness. Roman generals understood the psychology of fear deeply. They knew that armies could be defeated again and again, but the will to resist was harder to extinguish. That will lived in stories, songs, and memories. Queens were often the center of those stories. They were the face of resistance, the voice of defiance, the embodiment of national pride. If Rome wanted to end rebellion, it had to dismantle that image publicly. This is why punishment began with stripping away identity. Royal garments were not mere clothing. They were symbols of divine favor, ancestral legitimacy, and cultural continuity. To remove them was to declare that the queen's authority had never truly existed. Jewelry was taken not for its value, but for what it represented. Crowns, torques, and ceremonial ornaments carried meaning far beyond gold. When Rome removed them, it was rewriting reality. It was declaring, before witnesses, that the queen was no longer who she had been. This process was deliberately humiliating. Roman punishments were designed to reverse social order. Those who had commanded were made to obey. Those who had been honored were made to feel shame. For a queen, this reversal was devastating. She had once been addressed with reverence, surrounded by attendants, shielded by ritual. Now she was exposed, vulnerable, and watched. And Rome made sure she was watched. Visibility was essential. Punishment unseen was punishment wasted. Whether in a provincial city, a military camp, or the streets of Rome itself, the queen's suffering had an audience. Roman soldiers, officials, and civilians were all participants in the ritual. By watching, they learned their place in the imperial hierarchy. By watching, they absorbed the lesson Rome wanted to teach. The use of chains was particularly deliberate. Chains were not simply restraints, they were symbols of total domination. In Roman culture, chains were associated with slavery, the lowest possible social condition. To chain a queen was to declare that she had fallen not just from power, but from humanity as Rome defined it. She was no longer a ruler, no longer an equal enemy. She was property. But Rome understood that physical restraint alone was not enough. Psychological punishment mattered more. Queens were often forced to walk long distances, sometimes behind Roman troops, sometimes through cities that had once honored them. Each step reinforced the narrative of defeat. Each glance from the crowd reminded her, and everyone watching, that Rome's power was absolute. This was not done in anger. It was done calmly, methodically, and with purpose. Rome's cruelty was bureaucratic. The empire excelled at turning violence into procedure. Orders were written, timelines were followed, roles were assigned, punishment became routine, stripped of emotion, and transformed into policy. This made it easier to justify. A soldier carrying out orders was not cruel, he was obedient. A magistrate enforcing punishment was not vindictive, he was upholding Roman authority. Queens, once treated as sacred or semi-divine, were reduced to entries in official records. Yet even as Rome dehumanized these women, it remained deeply aware of their symbolic power. This created a tension within Roman punishment practices. Too much brutality could provoke sympathy. Too little could suggest weakness. Rome constantly calibrated its response, balancing terror with control. This balance is most clearly seen in public punishments. Public humiliation was one of Rome's most effective weapons. To the Romans, shame was worse than death. Honor defined social existence. To strip someone of honor was to annihilate them without shedding blood. For queens, whose authority was built on reverence and tradition, shame was especially destructive. Roman crowds were not passive observers. They were encouraged to mock, jeer, and celebrate. Their reactions were part of the punishment. Laughter, insults, and applause reinforced the message that resistance was not noble, it was ridiculous. By turning a defeated queen into an object of ridicule, Rome attempted to drain her story of dignity, but this approach revealed Rome's insecurity. If Rome were truly confident in its dominance, it would not have needed to humiliate so carefully. The empire's obsession with optics shows how deeply it feared the power of narrative. Rome knew that stories could travel farther than legions. A queen humiliated today could inspire revolt tomorrow if her suffering was interpreted as martyrdom rather than failure. This is why Roman authorities tightly controlled information. Official histories emphasized Roman mercy when it suited them and Roman severity when fear was needed. The queen's voice was silenced. Her version of events was erased. What survived was what Rome allowed to survive. Even execution, when it came, was often delayed. Immediate death would have ended the spectacle. Rome preferred drama, not punishment. Time allowed fear to spread. Time allowed rumors to grow. Time allowed Rome to demonstrate patience and inevitability. The queen lived long enough to be seen defeated again and again, each day reinforcing the message of Roman supremacy. Some queens were kept alive for years before their final fate was decided. During this time, they existed in a state worse than death, powerless, watched, remembered only for their defeat. This limbo was intentional. It showed that Rome controlled not only life and death, but time itself. For Rome, punishment was not about revenge, it was about education. Every chained queen taught a lesson. To her people, she demonstrated the cost of resistance. To Roman citizens, she reinforced the empire's strength. To future enemies, she served as a warning carved into living flesh. And yet, beneath this calculated cruelty lay fear. Rome feared that without spectacle, its authority would seem abstract. Laws and legions were powerful, but symbols were eternal. Queens were symbols Rome could not ignore. Their very existence challenged the idea that Rome was the center of the world. So Rome responded by turning punishment into performance. But performance is fragile. It relies on interpretation, and despite Rome's efforts, not all audiences saw what Rome intended. Some saw injustice rather than order. Some saw courage rather than defeat. Some saw a woman standing against an empire and refused to forget her. This is the great irony of Roman punishment. By making queens into spectacles, Rome preserved them in memory. By humiliating them publicly, Rome ensured that their stories would be retold. By trying to control the narrative, Rome revealed how dangerous it believed that narrative to be. Punishment as a message succeeded in the short term. Rebellions were crushed. Provinces were pacified. Order was restored, but in the long term, the message fractured, because centuries later, Rome's punishments are remembered less for their authority and more for their cruelty. The queens Rome sought to reduce to warnings have become symbols of resistance. And the empire that believed it could teach the world through fear ultimately taught it something else entirely. That power built on humiliation is never as permanent as it believes. Rome spoke through punishment. But history chose to listen differently. Boudica did not rise in a vacuum. Her story begins in a world where Rome believed it had already won. Britain, from the Roman perspective, was a distant, damp frontier, unruly, primitive, and ultimately manageable. Roman governors believed order could be imposed through treaties, client kings, and the quiet pressure of Roman law. For a time, this illusion held. Boudica was queen of the Iceni, a powerful tribe in eastern Britain. Her husband, Prasutagus, had ruled as a client king under Rome, a compromise designed to keep peace while slowly tightening imperial control. When he died, he attempted to protect his kingdom by leaving his wealth jointly to his daughters and the Roman emperor. In his mind, this gesture would secure his family's future. In Rome's mind, it was meaningless. Rome did not recognize female inheritance. Rome did not recognize tribal autonomy when it was inconvenient. And Rome did not recognize mercy when power could be seized instead. Roman officials moved swiftly. The Iceni lands were annexed outright. Tribal elites were stripped of property. Soldiers looted freely. When Boudica protested, when she asserted her rights as queen and guardian of her people, Rome responded with calculated brutality. She was publicly flogged. Her daughters were assaulted by Roman soldiers. This was not an act of uncontrolled violence. It was a statement. Rome was declaring that Boudica's authority meant nothing, that her body, her family, and her lineage were subject to Roman will. It was meant to humiliate her into submission and terrify her people into silence. Instead, it ignited one of the most devastating rebellions Rome ever faced. Boudica transformed from a violated queen into a symbol of rage and justice. Ancient sources describe her as tall, fierce, with a commanding presence and a voice that could carry across an army. Whether these descriptions are literal or shaped by Roman fear, they reveal something important. Rome needed her to appear larger than life, because her rebellion shook the empire's confidence. Boudica united tribes that had long been divided. The Iceni, the Trinovantes, and others rallied behind her. This alone was extraordinary. Tribal Britain was fragmented by nature. Rome had relied on these divisions to maintain control. Boudica shattered that strategy. Her speeches, as recorded by Roman historians, are likely reconstructed, but their themes are telling. She did not speak of conquest. She spoke of justice, of violated laws, of stolen freedom, of daughters dishonored. She framed the rebellion not as a war for power, but as a moral reckoning. This framing mattered. It turned resistance into duty. The uprising was swift and merciless. Roman settlements fell with shocking speed. Camulodunum, a symbol of Roman occupation, was destroyed. The temple dedicated to the deified Emperor Claudius was burned, a direct assault on Roman authority and religion. Londinium and Verulamium followed. Tens of thousands were killed, Roman citizens and British collaborators alike. For a brief moment, Rome lost control of Britain. This was not a minor provincial disturbance. It was an existential threat. Roman legions were scattered. Panic spread. Messages were sent across the empire. Reinforcements were rushed. Governors feared disgrace or execution if the province was lost. Rome responded with everything it had. Eventually, Roman discipline and tactics prevailed. The rebel army, though vast, was poorly armored and burdened by non-combatants who had followed in expectation of victory. In a decisive battle, Roman forces slaughtered the Britons. The rebellion collapsed in blood and smoke, and then came the question Rome dreaded. What to do with Boudica? In Roman punishment culture, the answer seemed obvious. A defeated enemy leader, especially one who had caused such devastation, should be captured, chained, and paraded. A triumph would cement Rome's restored authority. The people of Britain would see their queen humiliated. Rome would send a message across the empire that rebellion led only to disgrace. But Boudica was not an ordinary enemy. Roman sources diverge at this point, and that divergence is revealing. Some claim she fell ill and died. Others state plainly that she took poison. What they agree on is what did not happen. Boudica was never paraded in chains. She was never displayed in a Roman triumph. She was never publicly humiliated by the empire she defied. This absence is not accidental. Rome feared Boudica alive more than it desired her humiliation. To parade her through Roman streets would have turned her into a spectacle, but also into a martyr. Her story would have been retold not as failure, but as courage. Roman crowds might have mocked her, but British memory would have transformed her suffering into legend. Rome understood the power of martyrdom intimately. It had seen how executed rebels could become symbols. It had seen how memory could outlast fear, and Boudica's rebellion had already proven how deeply she resonated with her people. Allowing her to die on her own terms, or at least allowing that version of the story to circulate, was a strategic decision. If she took poison, it was an act of control. By choosing death, Boudica denied Rome the ultimate punishment, public humiliation. She preserved her dignity, she avoided chains, she refused to let Rome define her final image, and Rome quietly accepted this outcome. This acceptance reveals something crucial. Rome was not always confident enough to display its enemies. Sometimes it chose silence over spectacle. Sometimes erasure was safer than exposure. After the rebellion, Roman policy in Britain changed. Governors became more cautious. Excessive brutality was curbed, not out of compassion, but out of recognition that humiliation could provoke resistance rather than suppress it. Boudica had taught Rome a lesson it did not want to learn, that cruelty could create unity among the conquered. Yet Rome worked tirelessly to control how Boudica was remembered. Roman historians portrayed her as a savage barbarian, driven by emotion rather than reason. They emphasized her gender, her rage, her supposed irrationality. This portrayal was not neutral. It was designed to diminish her political intelligence and moral authority. By framing her rebellion as emotional hysteria, Rome attempted to reassure itself that order had been restored. But even in their attempts to belittle her, Roman writers could not hide their fear. They described the scale of destruction in vivid detail. They acknowledged the terror her forces inspired. They admitted how close Rome came to losing the province. These admissions undermine the narrative of Roman invincibility. They show an empire shaken by a woman it tried to erase. Boudica's disappearance from the stage, whether through suicide or illness, allowed Rome to avoid a public reckoning. There was no trial, no triumph, no chained queen. Instead, there was silence, and silence, for Rome, was sometimes the most powerful punishment. By denying Boudica a visible end, Rome attempted to deny her legacy. But this too failed. Oral tradition preserved her story. Centuries later, her name resurfaced, transformed into a symbol of resistance against imperial oppression. The irony is unavoidable. Rome feared that parading Boudica would immortalize her. By refusing to do so, Rome ensured that historians would ask why. That question kept her alive in memory. The gap in the record became part of the story. Boudica represents the limit of Roman punishment. She was a queen Rome could defeat militarily, but not fully dominate symbolically. She exposed the weakness beneath Roman spectacle, its dependence on controlled narratives. When Rome could not control the story, it chose absence over display. Her rebellion reminds us that punishment does not always end resistance. Sometimes it creates it. Sometimes the refusal to submit, even in death, becomes more powerful than any victory parade. Rome crushed Boudica's army. It burned her people's lands. It restored its authority in Britain, but it never truly captured Boudica, and that failure haunted the empire far longer than the rebellion itself. Cleopatra, Romans 7, understood Rome better than most Romans understood themselves. She had grown up watching the republic collapse into something more dangerous than monarchy, an empire that still pretended to hate kings while worshipping power above all else. From the moment she came to the throne of Egypt, she knew that survival depended not on armies alone, but on perception, symbolism, and control of narrative. This awareness shaped every decision she made, and ultimately, it shaped the way she chose to die. Cleopatra was not merely a queen in the traditional sense. She was the living embodiment of a civilization that was older than Rome itself. Egypt's rulers were not just political leaders. They were divine figures, intermediaries between gods and humans. Cleopatra ruled as Isis incarnate, or at least as her earthly reflection. To her people, she was not replaceable. To Rome, that made her intolerable. Rome could tolerate client kings, dependent rulers, and symbolic monarchs who existed at Rome's pleasure. What it could not tolerate was a queen who commanded loyalty independent of Roman approval. Cleopatra did exactly that. She ruled Egypt directly, spoke to her people in their own language, controlled the grain supply that fed Rome itself, and negotiated with Roman leaders as an equal rather than a subject. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were not romantic accidents, as Roman propaganda would later claim. They were strategic alliances formed by a ruler who understood that Rome's internal power struggles could be exploited. Cleopatra aligned herself with men who held real authority, not because she desired Rome's validation, but because she intended to preserve Egypt's independence through Roman weakness. This alone made her dangerous. After Caesar's assassination, Rome descended into chaos. Cleopatra watched carefully as Octavian and Antony emerged as rivals. She chose Antony, not out of sentimentality, but because his power base in the East aligned with Egypt's interests. Together, they created a vision of rule that terrified Rome, a world where power was shared between East and West, where Rome was no longer the unquestioned center. To Octavian, this was unforgivable. Octavian did not simply fight Antony and Cleopatra militarily. He waged a war of narrative. He portrayed Cleopatra as a corrupting foreign seductress, a witch queen who had ensnared a Roman hero and turned him against his own people. This was propaganda at its most effective. By framing the conflict as a moral crusade against Eastern decadence, Octavian transformed a civil war into a righteous struggle. Cleopatra was no longer a political rival. She was an existential threat to Roman identity. When Octavian's forces defeated Antony and Cleopatra at Actium, the military outcome was decisive, but the symbolic outcome was still unresolved. Antony fled back to Egypt, followed by Cleopatra. Rome now stood at the gates of one of the richest kingdoms in the ancient world, but conquest alone was not enough. Octavian needed legitimacy, he needed spectacle, he needed Cleopatra alive. Roman tradition demanded that great enemies be displayed. Triumphs were not merely celebrations, they were acts of domination written into public memory. A captured queen paraded through Rome in chains was proof that Rome ruled not only lands, but destinies. Cleopatra, more than any enemy Octavian had faced, represented the ultimate prize, and Cleopatra knew it. She understood exactly what awaited her if she were captured alive. Roman triumphs were carefully staged humiliations. Captives were forced to walk behind the victor's chariot, often dressed in exaggerated or foreign clothing, their defeat dramatized for the crowd. They were mocked, jeered at, reduced to objects of entertainment. For a queen who had ruled as a goddess, this was worse than death. Cleopatra would have been stripped of her regalia, her identity dismantled piece by piece. Her divine status would have been mocked. Her power reduced to a cautionary tale. Roman poets would have immortalized her not as a ruler, but as a warning. Her children might have been spared, but only as trophies of Rome's mercy, raised under Roman control. This fate was not hypothetical. Rome had done it before. Cleopatra had studied Roman history. She knew how queens and kings were paraded, how dignity was destroyed in public before a cheering crowd. She knew that survival under Rome often meant a living death. Cleopatra refused that future. After Antony's defeat and suicide, Cleopatra attempted negotiation. This was not desperation, it was calculation. She tested Octavian's intentions, probing for any possibility of preserving her dignity or her children's future. Octavian, for his part, spoke carefully. He offered vague assurances, carefully avoiding any promise regarding her personal fate. Cleopatra understood the silence. Octavian needed her alive for his triumph. He needed her humiliation to complete his transformation from warlord to savior of Rome. Cleopatra was to be the centerpiece of his spectacle, the exotic queen brought low, proof that Rome had conquered not just Egypt, but the East itself. That realization sealed her decision. Cleopatra prepared for death with the same care she had given to rule. Ancient accounts describe her testing poisons, studying which would kill quickly and which would distort the body. This detail matters. Cleopatra was not seeking escape alone. She was preserving her image. She wanted to die as a queen, not as a broken prisoner. Her suicide was a final act of political control. By dying on her own terms, Cleopatra denied Octavian his most powerful symbol. He could parade Egypt, gold, statues, and captives, but not her. The absence of Cleopatra in his triumph was a silence that spoke louder than chains ever could. Octavian attempted to control the narrative afterward, but the damage was done. He claimed victory. He took Egypt. He became Augustus, Rome's first emperor in all but name. Yet Cleopatra's death haunted his triumph. The woman he had demonized refused to play her role in his story. Roman historians, writing under imperial authority, continued the propaganda. Cleopatra was portrayed as decadent, manipulative, and morally corrupt. Her intelligence was minimized, her political skill dismissed as seduction. This was deliberate. Rome could not afford to let her be remembered as a capable ruler who challenged its supremacy. But even in their distortions, Roman writers revealed their fear. They emphasized her defiance. They noted her composure in death. They recorded her final acts with a mixture of condemnation and fascination. Cleopatra could not be erased. She was too large, too significant, too deeply embedded in the events that reshaped Rome itself. Her suicide marked the end of more than a dynasty. It marked the end of the Hellenistic world and the beginning of Roman imperial rule. Egypt became a personal possession of the emperor, its wealth flowing directly into Roman hands. The grain supply that fed Rome was secured, the East was subdued, but Cleopatra denied Rome something essential, moral victory. Rome could conquer bodies. Cleopatra conquered the narrative of her own end. She chose how she would be remembered, at least in part. She refused chains. She refused mockery. She refused to be reduced to a lesson written by her enemies. In doing so, she exposed a fundamental weakness in Roman power. Rome relied on spectacle to assert dominance. When spectacle failed, so did its claim to absolute control. Cleopatra showed that even the mightiest empire could be defied through refusal. Her death was not an act of despair. It was a calculated political decision made by a ruler who understood that legacy outlives life. Cleopatra chose memory over survival, dignity over submission. Rome won the war, but Cleopatra won the final act. Centuries later, her name still commands attention. She is remembered not as a chained captive, but as a queen who looked at the full weight of Roman punishment and said no. Rome's triumph passed, Cleopatra's defiance endured. And that is why Rome never truly punished Cleopatra. She punished Rome by denying it the one thing it desired most, the power to define her end. Roman triumphs were among the most spectacular demonstrations of power ever conceived in the ancient world. They were elaborate, ritualized displays of victory designed to impress, intimidate, and teach a clear lesson. Rome was supreme, yet within the grandeur of these parades there was a darker, more insidious purpose, especially when it came to captured queens. For Rome, the triumph was not merely a celebration. It was a tool of domination, a public demonstration that the empire could dismantle authority, erase dignity, and rewrite history itself. When a king was captured, he might be paraded, yes, but kings were often replaced. Their lineage could be absorbed, their titles appropriated, and their lands annexed. A queen, however, presented a more complex problem. Her power was personal, symbolic, and often intertwined with the identity of her people. She was the living embodiment of a nation, and her defeat carried more weight than the conquest of territory. That is why Rome approached the treatment of queens with calculated cruelty. The spectacle of the triumph was meticulous. Captured queens were usually dressed in clothing that emphasized their foreignness, highlighting the contrast between the conquering Romans and the defeated ruler. Sometimes they were adorned with garments that mocked their former status. Sometimes they were stripped of all insignia of power, leaving them visually and symbolically exposed. Their movements were controlled, their posture dictated, their chains visible to the public. Every detail reinforced the lesson that Rome had the power not only to defeat armies, but to dismantle the social and cultural identity of rulers. Public humiliation was central to this process. The presence of a conquered queen in a triumph was designed to shock and awe the audience. Citizens, soldiers, and officials watched as someone who had once commanded armies and inspired loyalty was reduced to a figure of spectacle. Mockery, jeers, and even physical abuse were part of the performance. By observing, the audience internalized Rome's message. Power outside of Roman control was dangerous, and resistance was futile. The humiliation of the queen was, in essence, a form of psychological warfare directed not only at her, but at the conquered people she represented and the empire's own population. Yet Roman authorities were acutely aware that public exposure carried risks. The spectacle that humiliated could also inspire. If the queen maintained her dignity, if she endured the parade with composure, she could transform humiliation into legend. She could become a martyr, a symbol of defiance that outlived her captivity. This tension was something Rome had to navigate carefully. Excessive cruelty risked admiration from the very people Rome sought to intimidate. Too little, and the demonstration of dominance might appear weak. The treatment of captured queens was therefore a finely calibrated act, balancing visibility, degradation, and control of narrative. Execution was often a final component, but not always immediate. Queens might be displayed during a triumph, subjected to days or even weeks of scrutiny before being executed or removed from public view. The Romans understood that a draw, now demonstration, amplified the psychological impact. Conquered population had time to witness the subjugation of their ruler, internalizing the lesson that resistance brought inevitable suffering. The queen's body, her chains, her public demeanor, all became instruments of statecraft. But not all queens were executed. Some were kept alive for political purposes. Exile, forced marriage, or ceremonial roles stripped of real power were common alternatives. These strategies served multiple purposes. They neutralized the threat of rebellion, preserved Rome's reputation for mercy to some degree, and maintained the queen as a cautionary symbol for her people. A living queen who could no longer wield power was more useful to Rome than a dead one who might be mourned or remembered with heroism. The psychological effect of seeing one's ruler alive but impotent was profound. It reinforced the narrative that Rome was absolute, controlling not only territory, but life itself. In some cases, erasure rather than execution became the ultimate punishment. To remove a queen from records, to suppress her name and achievements, was to attempt to annihilate her memory. Rome understood the enduring power of stories, songs, and oral traditions. If a queen could survive in the minds of her people, her authority might outlast her physical presence. Historical accounts, official decrees, and inscriptions were tools used to control what future generations would remember. By silencing the queen in official narratives, Rome sought to complete her subjugation, not merely of body and land, but of legacy. The triumph also served an international purpose. Messages of conquest were not limited to Roman citizens. Envoys, neighboring kingdoms, and distant provinces observed the spectacle and absorbed the implicit warning. Queens, as highly visible symbols of resistance, made the message particularly potent. Other nations saw that rebellion against Rome would result not merely in military defeat, but in public degradation of their leaders, the stripping away of identity, and the complete subordination of sovereignty. In this way, triumphs were as much about diplomacy through fear as they were about celebration. Yet the very visibility that made the triumph effective also carried vulnerabilities. Audiences were unpredictable. Soldiers, citizens, and even other rulers could interpret what they saw in ways not intended by the organizers. A queen who retained dignity, composure, or eloquence could turn humiliation into inspiration. Her resilience could resonate with conquered peoples, fostering the very loyalty and resistance Rome sought to destroy. This reality forced Roman planners to consider not only what the queen endured, but how she would appear to others. Control over perception became nearly as important as control over her body. Roman writers, aware of this danger, sought to diminish captured queens in historical accounts. They emphasized emotional excess, moral weakness, or irrationality. They portrayed women as less capable than men, attributing their actions to passion rather than strategy. Even when a queen had skillfully commanded armies or negotiated with Roman leaders, historians framed her as a cautionary example of female folly. This narrative control was another form of punishment, subtle, psychological, and long-lasting. It attempted to reduce the queen's achievements to footnotes while magnifying her failures in the public imagination. The psychological dimension of punishment extended to her own people. By controlling the queen's fate, Rome sent a message directly to her subjects. They saw that their leader's authority could be stripped, her dignity publicly destroyed, and her autonomy erased. This demonstration served to undermine morale, instill fear, and discourage collective resistance. The population internalized the consequences of rebellion not merely intellectually, but emotionally. Witnessing a beloved queen degraded or eliminated was a visceral lesson in power and submission. In some cases, the treatment of queens in triumphs was combined with other forms of state-sanctioned humiliation. Captured families, advisors, and nobles were often paraded alongside the queen. Their presence reinforced the sense of total subjugation. The queen was not alone in her suffering. The consequences of resistance were collective. By involving others, Rome amplified the impact of punishment and ensured that multiple layers of society were implicated in the warning. Yet despite the meticulous planning, Rome could not fully control outcomes. Public reaction could be unpredictable. Crowds sometimes sympathized, sometimes cheered, and sometimes simply gawked. The emotional responses of the audience had the potential to alter the intended effect. In some instances, the queen's courage in the face of humiliation inspired admiration rather than fear, complicating Rome's narrative of dominance. Such reactions demonstrate the precariousness of spectacle as a tool of power. While triumphs were meant to assert authority, they could inadvertently immortalize the very figures they sought to degrade. Execution, when it occurred after a triumph, was often quiet and efficient, designed to remove the queen from the public stage without provoking further attention. Poison, strangulation, or other methods ensured that the spectacle concluded on Rome's terms. The timing of execution was as deliberate as the spectacle itself. Immediate death would have truncated the psychological impact. Delayed death extended it. The queen's endurance in public view, followed by her final removal, reinforced the idea that Rome controlled not only life and death, but the experience of both. Even queens who were spared immediate death were effectively neutralized. Their political agency was removed, their authority stripped. They were living warnings to their own people and to neighboring states. These measures served Rome's interests strategically, providing both a demonstration of mercy and a demonstration of power. By keeping a queen alive but powerless, Rome maintained control over both perception and reality. In addition to physical and psychological measures, Rome sought to control the narrative in perpetuity. Historical records, inscriptions, and official accounts were carefully curated to emphasize Roman triumph and minimize the queen's agency. Her successes were downplayed or attributed to manipulation, chance, or male figures. Her resistance was reframed as emotional excess or moral weakness. This control of narrative extended the punishment beyond her life, shaping how future generations would understand her role. Rome recognized that the most enduring punishment was not in chains or execution, but in erasure or misrepresentation. The treatment of queens in triumphs illustrates a central aspect of Roman power, the fusion of military conquest with symbolic domination. The empire understood that defeating armies was insufficient. Authority had to be demonstrated, narratives controlled, and memories shaped. Captured queens were central to this process. Their bodies, their actions, and their reputations became tools of statecraft, carefully manipulated to reinforce the ideology of Roman supremacy. Yet the very care Rome took to control queens also reveals a deep-seated anxiety. If a queen could inspire fear through her life and dignity, she could also inspire hope in her people. Rome's meticulous planning reflects an awareness that power could not be assumed, only asserted through constant vigilance. The spectacle of humiliation, therefore, was both an instrument of authority and a measure of vulnerability. It exposed the empire's recognition that narrative, symbolism, and perception were as important as military might. Despite these measures, history demonstrates the limits of Roman punishment. Many queens survived in memory long after their chains were gone. Their stories continued to inspire resistance, admiration, or fascination. Boudica, Cleopatra, Zenobia, and others became enduring symbols of defiance. The triumphs that intended to erase them instead ensured their survival in collective memory, illustrating the paradoxical consequences of spectacle and public humiliation. Roman triumphs combined theater, ritual, and statecraft into a potent tool of domination. For captured queens, they were instruments of degradation, psychological control, and narrative manipulation. Chains, visibility, public mockery, execution, and controlled erasure all served to dismantle authority and assert supremacy. Yet the very mechanisms of punishment also preserved the memory of these women, creating enduring symbols of resistance that outlasted the empire itself. In attempting to control both bodies and stories, Rome revealed the fragile limits of power and the enduring strength of those who refused to be fully conquered. Rome's treatment of captured queens reveals a deeper truth about the nature of power in the ancient world. It is easy to look at the empire and see only its military might, its engineering marvels, or its political institutions. But beneath the veneer of law, marble, and disciplined legions lay a profound anxiety about authority, legitimacy, and control. Queens, more than any other category of enemy, exposed the vulnerabilities of Roman power. They embodied what Rome could not fully conquer: loyalty, belief, and identity that were independent of imperial decree. Understanding why Rome punished queens so brutally requires a closer examination of both Roman ideology and the symbolic potency of female leadership. From the Roman perspective, women were naturally subordinate. Society was structured around male authority, from the paterfamilias in the household to the consuls in the state. Leadership, military command, and public authority were coded masculine. When Rome encountered women who defied this structure, particularly queens who wielded political, military, or religious power, it was unsettling. Such women challenged the very assumptions upon which Roman society rested. They demonstrated that leadership was not inherently male, that loyalty could exist outside Rome's control, and that influence did not require Roman sanction. A queen could inspire devotion in ways a male ruler under Roman domination could not, and this unpredictability frightened the empire. The fear Rome felt toward queens was amplified by the personal nature of female leadership in many societies. Unlike client kings who could be replaced or neutralized, queens often ruled through lineage, tradition, and direct personal authority. They were the embodiment of their people's sovereignty, and their authority was inseparable from their identity. When such a queen was defeated, the consequences went beyond the loss of territory or submission to Roman law. They touched the very core of a community's cultural and political existence. Rome recognized that if a queen remained dignified or heroic in defeat, she could become a rallying point for future resistance. Therefore, punishment was designed to be comprehensive, targeting not only the body but also the image, reputation, and symbolic power of the queen. Physical punishment was only the beginning. Chains, imprisonment, forced marches, and public exposure were employed not simply to restrain, but to humiliate. Every detail of how a queen was presented, her clothing, her posture, her visibility, was carefully controlled. Stripped of royal garb, adorned in humiliating attire, or displayed behind the victor's chariot, she was transformed from ruler to spectacle. The goal was to convey a clear message. Rome could control even the most potent symbols of sovereignty, and resistance was futile. The psychological impact on her people was central to this strategy. Seeing a revered queen in chains, subjected to public mockery, created an enduring impression of Roman dominance, deterring rebellion and reinforcing loyalty to the empire. Yet Rome understood that humiliation alone was insufficient. The empire was acutely aware of the potential for a queen's dignity to survive public defeat. Composure in the face of chains, silent endurance, or acts of defiance could transform punishment into legend. Rome therefore sought to manage perception as carefully as it managed physical reality. The timing of punishment, the staging of triumphs, and the curation of historical records were all part of a sophisticated system of narrative control. Roman writers emphasized emotional excess, irrationality, or moral weakness in queens, downplaying their strategic intelligence and political skill. By doing so, the empire attempted to erase their authority and preserve its own image of infallibility. Execution was not always immediate or uniform. Queens might be displayed for days, weeks, or longer, subjected to continuous observation before final removal or death. In some cases, they were spared execution entirely, instead subjected to exile, forced marriages, or ceremonial roles devoid of power. This extended punishment served multiple purposes. It neutralized potential threats, demonstrated Roman mercy to some degree, and maintained the queen as a living symbol of subjugation. By stripping her of authority while keeping her alive, Rome asserted control over both her fate and the perception of her power. It was a subtle but effective form of psychological domination, ensuring that her influence could not extend beyond what Rome permitted. The use of spectacle in Roman punishment reveals an important aspect of empire. Control over narrative was inseparable from control over territory. By parading queens through the streets, displaying them in triumphs, or recording their alleged excesses in official histories, Rome sought to dictate how events would be remembered. Chains, mockery, and public exposure were tools not only of coercion, but also of storytelling. The conquered queen's body became a text to be read by soldiers, citizens, and neighboring states alike. Through these carefully staged performances, Rome broadcast a message of inevitability. Resistance would be met with total domination, and no one, not even queens, could escape its grasp. Yet these strategies carried inherent risks. Public displays of punishment were unpredictable. Crowds could respond with sympathy, admiration, or fascination. A queen who endured humiliation with grace could turn Roman spectacle into inspiration for her own people. Historical records reveal that even in attempts to diminish her, Rome acknowledged the extraordinary presence and agency of certain queens. They could not fully erase their significance, and in trying to suppress it, the empire inadvertently preserved their memory. Boudica, Cleopatra, Zenobia, and other queens became enduring symbols of resistance, precisely because Rome's punishment highlighted the threat they once posed. The symbolic power of queens was not limited to their lives. Even in death, they continued to challenge Roman authority by controlling when and how a queen was executed, or by allowing her to die on her own terms. Rome sought to manage her posthumous influence. Suicide, illness, or discreet removal from public view were often preferred to public execution because they limited the potential for martyrdom. Yet even this strategy was imperfect. The stories of these queens survived, passed down through oral tradition, chronicled by historians, and remembered by the communities they had led. In attempting to erase them, Rome highlighted their significance. Queens also represented cultural continuity in ways kings could not. Their authority was intertwined with religious practices, lineage, and traditions that predated Roman conquest. Destroying their power required more than defeating armies. It required undermining belief systems and social structures. Public punishment, narrative control, and calculated erasure were attempts to achieve this, but such measures could never fully eliminate the cultural resonance a queen held. Even generations later, the memory of their leadership endured, reminding Rome and future observers of the limits of imperial control. The fear Rome felt toward queens extended beyond political and cultural concerns. It was also existential. A queen who commanded loyalty independent of Rome could ignite rebellion anywhere, at any time. Unlike male rulers whose authority could be co-opted or replaced, a queen's symbolic power was resilient. Her example could inspire new leaders, new strategies, and new resistance movements. This understanding underpinned the extraordinary care Rome took in punishing queens. Each act of humiliation, each triumph, each recorded history was a defensive measure against the intangible threat of memory and inspiration. In some instances, Rome's punishment was as much about self-protection as domination. By carefully dismantling a queen's authority, the empire reinforced its own legitimacy. Every chain, every insult, every coerced act was a lesson in the fragility of sovereignty outside Roman law. Rome projected stability through the destruction of opposing authority, reassuring both its citizens and client states that the empire's reach was absolute. This projection of power was a form of preemptive control aimed at preventing rebellion before it could gain momentum. Despite all of Rome's calculated cruelty, the endurance of these queens in history underscores the limitations of punishment as a tool of total domination. Physical suffering, public humiliation, and narrative suppression could not erase memory. The symbolic authority of queens outlasted the empire's immediate control. Their stories, shaped by both fear and admiration, survived to influence generations far beyond the borders of Roman dominion. In this way, the very measures Rome employed to crush authority inadvertently ensured its preservation. The psychological complexity of punishing queens also highlights an essential characteristic of Roman power. It was both sophisticated and insecure. Triumphs, spectacles, and narrative control were instruments of authority, but they depended on perception, interpretation, and the compliance of audiences. A queen who defied humiliation, retained dignity, or inspired admiration threatened the empire in ways that military conquest could not mitigate. Rome's extensive planning, procedural cruelty, and narrative manipulation reflect an acute awareness of these vulnerabilities. The empire understood that power was fragile, contingent on both obedience and belief. Ultimately, Rome punished queens so brutally because they represented what the empire could never fully dominate: leadership rooted in identity, legitimacy, and devotion that existed outside Roman authority. Every chain, every humiliation, every carefully staged public act was designed to neutralize this threat, to control perception, and to assert supremacy. Yet these efforts also revealed Rome's limitations. Authority imposed through spectacle, narrative control, and psychological manipulation could constrain, but never fully erase, the memory of extraordinary leadership. Queens like Boudica, Cleopatra, and Zenobia remain enduring symbols precisely because Roman punishment acknowledged their power even as it sought to suppress it. Rome's fear of queens was, in a sense, a fear of memory itself. Conquest could destroy armies, seize lands, and impose laws, but memory, embodied in the figure of a defiant queen, could survive chains, exile, and even death. Punishment, no matter how elaborate, could only shape that memory, not eliminate it. The endurance of these queens in historical consciousness is a testament to their extraordinary authority and a reminder of the limits of even the most formidable empires. In conclusion, Rome's brutal punishment of queens was a calculated response to a unique threat. It combined physical cruelty, psychological manipulation, public spectacle, and narrative control to neutralize authority, intimidate populations, and assert supremacy. Yet the very measures intended to erase queens often preserved them, highlighting the enduring power of leadership that exists independently of empire. The fear, meticulous planning, and complex strategies behind Rome's actions reflect both the sophistication and the insecurity of an empire that could conquer lands but could not fully conquer the human spirit. These queens, through their resistance, composure, and legacy, reveal that authority rooted in identity, loyalty, and belief transcends chains, triumphs, and even the weight of empire itself.